Okay, I'm Marlene Howe, and I live at Glacier Hills here in Ann Arbor. I was born in a little hospital on East Middle Street in Chelsea, and that's still there, but it's not a hospital anymore. It's a private residence. And my parents had lived on a 300-acre farm on Scioto Church Road since 1932, and that's where I grew up. And since I had no brothers, I helped with the farm work from an early age. I had regular chores such as feeding the 250 sheep, mowing the lawn, and helping in the garden for my mother. But when I was working in the fields and doing the same work as the hired man was doing, I was paid the same as a hired man, and I earned a good bit of my money to put myself through college working in the fields. I also earned money for college by working in an office in Ann Arbor in the county building for several summers after I graduated from high school. And because I was a farm kid, I was able to get a driver's license at age 14. We went to the sheriff's office, and my test was having my dad tell the sheriff deputy that I could drive. I didn't have a written test, I didn't have a driving test, but I got my license. And I didn't take driver's education until I was a senior in high school. And by then I'd been driving a stick shift farm truck since I was 12 years old. I went to one-room country school from kindergarten through 8th grade, and then went to high school in Chelsea. Some people think that students were not well educated in country schools, but I totally disagree with that. My best friend since before I started school and I were the only ones in our grade. We would work our way through our textbooks by the end of the first semester, and then we would go on to what now we would be calling directed study. We thought up projects, and the teacher gave us assignments of various projects, and we worked our way through them for the rest of the school year. We had a very wide range of abilities among the students in our school. There were several children that were severely mentally handicapped, and then we had children who would go on to be valedictorians of their high school classes. And we had at least one that went on and became an engineer, graduating from the University of Michigan. We learned to accept everyone, and we helped each other. I was very active in 4-H from age 10 to 18, and I learned to sew, knit, cook, can foods, garden, raise sheep, and many other things, most of which I still do, though it's been a long time since I've raised any sheep. There were many opportunities because of my sewing projects. I had an opportunity to model my outfits on the stage of the auditorium at Michigan State University. With my best friend, I mentioned before, we gave a demonstration that won a trip to Washington, D.C. And I was able to show my sheep both locally and at the state level at Michigan State. And at the time, I didn't think very much of it, but I didn't realize how much of a sacrifice it was for my father to take time off the busiest time in farming for a farmer and haul my sheep back and forth to various shows and up to East Lansing and back. There were many opportunities for leadership experience and meeting with other young people. By the time I graduated from high school, I knew many young people from all around Washtenaw County and all around the state also because of the different 4-H activities. My university education was at Michigan State University for undergrad, and then Eastern Michigan University for my master's. I completed my bachelor's in 3 years by going to summer school. And the last summer that I took classes at State, I was carrying 24 credits, and normally you take 16 credits. It was a very heavy load, and I was in class from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, every day, all summer. It was very difficult, but I did manage to do it. My first teaching job was in Pinckney, and then we moved to Monroe County, where my husband taught at Dundee High School and then at Monroe County Community College. In Monroe County, I taught 6th grade 1 year and then went into guidance and counseling at Dundee High School. With having children, I was in and out of working several times, and I also worked at Summerfield High School, which is in Petersburg down in Monroe County. I have 3 children. My oldest daughter is a software engineer in Columbus, Ohio. My son is an accountant who works for a Japanese company and manages aftermarket distribution centers in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and Panama. That's the Panama that's in Central America. And my youngest daughter lives in Monroe County and has her own practice, working mostly with patients with epilepsy after having done the same at Mott for about 11 years. I have 8 grandchildren from age 14 to 32. The oldest is a lawyer here in Ann Arbor, and the 2 youngest are still in high school. And my only son is a graduate student at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And my first great-grandchild was born this past February. I was able to hold him once before the shutdown, but at least I get a lot of pictures texted to me on a very pretty regular basis. Matter of fact, I have more pictures of him than I have of my own children. In 1983, my youngest daughter graduated from high school and went to college, and I bought a franchise for a bulk food warehouse store, and I moved to Grand Rapids to try my hand at business. It was a great adventure, but a very expensive one. They say that 9 out of 10 new businesses fail before the end of the first year. But I managed to last a year and a half. But then I had to decide whether to put more money into the business and move the location or to close, and I decided to close, and that too was quite an adventure and very much a learning experience, because I had 7.5 tons of equipment from the store to dispose of, and I managed to sell almost all of it. I went back into guidance and counseling at Fenville High School, which is south of Holland, and the school had a very diverse population. We had students that were from families that had a butler, and also students from families that barely had a roof over their head. About 30% of the students were Hispanic, but many of these Hispanic families were 2nd and 3rd generation. I also and couldn't speak Spanish. I learned that it was an interesting. You kind of expect if it's a Hispanic student, they know how to speak Spanish, but not necessarily true. I was there for 10 years until retiring in 1996. And Fenville is the location of the Goose Festival, which is quite an occasion. The town decided that if Holland could have the Tulip Festival, they needed a festival too. Holland had tulips, Fenville had geese. There's a large area outside of the town that was designated as a flyway for the geese to stop and overnight when they're migrating in the spring and in the fall. One day on my way to school in the spring, I counted 23 different V's of geese flying north while I was driving south. And it's quite a sight. Saugatuck, which is the next town to the west of Fenville, decided that they needed a festival also. So they started the Saugaduck Festival, so they were emphasizing ducks. Then there's a little town north of Holland that has a dandelion festival, and I'm not sure how they came up with that. But there's a lot of community spirit over there. And I lived in Holland most of the time that I was in West Michigan. After I moved back to Monroe County, I used to spend January through March in a cottage on Lake Michigan. Most people go south for the warm weather. I went to West Michigan and got a lot worse weather than what we had here. But at Lake Michigan in the winter is absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful. It changes about every 15 minutes, the look. And I really love doing it. And it was nice to be able to kind of slip back into my previous life there. I knew a lot of people, and it was nice to just kind of get back to my previous 10 years. I stayed in Michigan for a year after I retired, and then decided, for practical reasons, I stayed in Holland for a year, and after I retired, I decided it was for practical reasons to move back to Monroe County. So I bought a house here, or there in Monroe County, and it had a 3-acre lot, and I was there for 20 years, and I did a lot of gardening and landscaping. I planted my own little woods as a windbreak to the west of the house. I had lots of gardening projects. At one time I had 17 different varieties of sunflowers, and I also at one time had 16 varieties of daylilies. Had lots of flower beds, and I gradually decreased the gardening part and planted more grass because it got more and more difficult to take care of it. I've been at Glacier Hills for 5 years, and very much appreciate the opportunity to garden in a raised bed. I also have a little patch behind my deck with perennials in it that I had brought with me from Monroe County. I also have an extensive deck garden. I have lots of pots, mostly herbs, flowers, and a few vegetables. And that's been a lot of fun too. I've been sewing since I was 10 years old, and as an adult I made most of my children's clothes, my own clothes, and even my husband's suits. In 1982 I discovered quilting. It's not that I didn't know quilting existed, but I never tried to do it myself. And I didn't know that anybody in my family had done any quilting until my grandmother died, and my mother gave me two of her quilts that she apparently made in the 1920s or 30s, someplace in there. But she'd apparently just stashed them away in a trunk and never really used them, I don't think. Anyway, once I took a class in a little quilt shop in Saline, I was hooked. I'm a wannabe artist. I love to sew. I enjoy figuring things out, and I always liked geometry, and what better hobby for those interests. It had everything. When I moved to Grand Rapids, the only person I knew was my daughter, who was a student at Calvin College. Well, it's Calvin University now, I guess. I joined the West Michigan Quilt Kit and took a lot of classes. I met a lot of other quilters. Many of them I still keep in touch with. There was also opportunity to exhibit my work, group travel to large quilt shows, and membership in small sit-and-stitch groups. I'm still part of small groups in both Monroe and Tecumseh, and we get together once a month, and now we're getting together on Zoom, but it works. In 1994, I was at the National Quilting Association show in Bowling Green, Ohio, and one of the vendors' booths was showing a quilt design computer program. Long story short, even though I had yet to buy a computer, I bought the program and got to know the woman who had developed it with her husband. I became a part-time salesperson for them. I would go around to guild meetings, quilt guild meetings, and lecture and demonstrate the program. And then I also did vendors' booths at quilt shows. I didn't make much money at it, but it was a lot of fun. I met a lot of people, and I really learned how to use the program very well. I did it about 2 years, and when I started having back problems from holding the big computer back then, I had the tall desktop computer, and the monitors were big and heavy, and then I also took a printer with me, so I was hauling some pretty good stuff. I had a garden cart that I would stick in the trunk and haul things around, but it was a lot of lifting, and I started having problems with my back, so I quit doing that, although I really enjoyed it. The quilt program was called EQ, and when I started with it, it didn't have a number because it was the very first version, and now I have version 8, EQ 8. So there's been a lot of progress in what it can do since they started out with it. When I first started quilting in 1982, I would draw out the blocks on graph paper. Then I'd convert those pieces to templates by adding seam allowance, and then I'd put, attach this to a cardboard from a cereal box and make templates. And then you draw around the template on the back of the fabric, and then you cut the fabric out with scissors, and very time-consuming and not terribly accurate. My first quilt was pieced by hand and quilted by hand, and with the sewing machine it was only used to put on the binding. Now I use the computer to draw the blocks, test different layouts, and determine the number of blocks and size. And once I'm satisfied with the project, I have the computer print out the quilt, print out the various templates in the sizes that I need, and finally figure the yardage that's needed for the quilt. Quite a difference from 1982. Now I seldom use the scissors at all other than to cut thread. Pieces are cut using a rotary cutter and an acrylic rulers and on a special cutting mat. The rotary cutter is extremely sharp and looks like a small pizza cutter. It's rolled along the edge of the acrylic ruler, which has been very carefully placed, and you can cut 4 or 5 layers of fabric at a time, and there are many specialty rulers also. I seldom hand piece or hand quilt anymore. Someone new to quilting probably has never done that. They machine piece their quilts or machine applique quilts, and then they send them to a quilter, to a professional quilter with a long arm machine to finish. We call it quilting by checkbook. As a document, I've documented my quilting, and recently counted that I have made about 295 quilts since 1982, and many of them were full-sized bed quilts, but a lot of them were wall quilts or baby quilts for family. I've also made over 100 small children's quilts that my daughter gave to her patients at Mott when she was working there. And I have a number of unfinished quilts and so much fabric stored in plastic bins in my garage that it's a little embarrassing. I've decided that there are 2 kinds of quilters. The one type decides what she wants to make, that she wants to make a quilt for a spare bedroom. She chooses a pattern, buys the fabric and the amounts that the pattern calls for, and makes the quilt, not starting on another one until the first is finished. The other kind of quilter has a whole lot of quilt patterns and books with patterns. She goes to the quilt shop often and to see all of the beautiful fabric. She buys a yard or 2 or 3 of several different kinds of fabrics and only has a vague idea what the finished product is going to be. And over the years, and many quilt shops result in owning lots and lots of fabric. And I guess that's the kind of quilter I am. At this point, I try to stay out of quilt shops and only visit one if I need a specific fabric to finish a quilt. I was bemoaning the fact that I had so much unused fabric when I was in a class one time, and one of the other participants said, "Now, if your hobby was stamp collecting, would you feel that you had to send letters with those stamps?" And I felt much better. And actually, when I finished the wedding quilt that I owe one of my granddaughters and the 2 high school graduation quilts that are coming up I may start making donation quilts again. One of my friends that when I lived in Holland loved to travel, and we did a lot of traveling together. She was also a quilter, and many of our trips were quilt related. We went on a quilter's cruise to Alaska. We went to Europe several times to international quilt shows. And we went to Japan to a huge quilt show in Tokyo. The trips included all of the regular things you would see in a group tour, but it also had quilt-related activities. Many times we would meet with local quilters. We visited a quilt guild meeting in Juneau, Alaska, and we had tea with a group of quilters in Osaka, Japan. And people don't realize that quilting is big in other countries also. It's pretty big here. There are about 22 million quilters in the United States, the last time I heard a figure. But Japan, Australia, the Netherlands, and Germany also have a lot of quilters and quilt events. And one of our trips that was not quilt related was a 24-day bus trip through 10 countries in Europe. It was a bit of a marathon, and while we were exhausted from riding the bus, I think we have a more realistic view of what the country is like than when you just fly in and out of the big cities. I also traveled in Germany with my cousin. We rented a car and drove around Germany and the Netherlands for 10 days. And among other places we visited was the little town where my great-great-grandfather came from. He settled in Manchester in the 1800s, as did about 1/3 of the little town. And walking through the cemetery there was like walking through a cemetery in Manchester. The names were the same. There's a historical marker and a little church on the corner of Pleasant Lake Road and M52 north of Manchester, and it indicates that my great-great-grandfather, Bernard Kuhl, was one of the founders of that church. And he was the one that immigrated from Germany. I had a couple of other significant trips, and one was a 10-day camping trip around Texas with my children when they were 3, 8, and 9. And it included putting up one of those heavy canvas tents that I had never put up before, camping on a red anthill in Houston, almost running out of gas on a ranch road in about 1,000,000 miles from anywhere, and camping on the Gulf Shore on Padre Island a couple of days before a hurricane came in. It was actually a really fun trip, and I learned a simple but important lesson, that if you miss your exit on the freeway, there's always another one, and who knows what interesting things you might find. The other trip was a 5-week trip across the country to the West Coast in an escort with my 16-year-old daughter, a pop tent, and a one-burner Coleman. And we had a general idea where we were going, but allowed for finding things we were not planning on seeing, and it was a great adventure. And I might mention that if you go on a trip with a 16-year-old girl for 5 weeks in an escort, you're either going to get close or you're going to not be able to stand each other by the time you get back. Fortunately, we got a lot closer. I was quite ill 8 years ago. I left home in an ambulance on January 13th and did not return home until March 19th. And I was not able to quilt in those 2 months, but I had a lot of time to think. And I thought about how much I had enjoyed quilting and all of the great classes I'd taken. And I decided to make a tribute to my teacher's quilt when I was able to sew again. I did a lot of planning in my head, and when I was able to make a block for each of the 30 teachers that I wanted to include in the quilt, some of the blocks were made, or at least started in the class. Others had to adjust. I had to adjust the size to match the other blocks, and the 2 of them I scaled down from a 40-inch by 40-inch wall quilt pattern to 12-inch blocks, and that was not easy. And on the back of each block is a rather large label that indicates the teacher where I took the class and other information that might be interesting. It was a bit of a challenge, but fun. I wanted to exhibit it in a juried show, or there are two huge shows in the States that are kind of the prestige shows for quilters. One of them is in Paducah, which is called Quilt City, and one of them is in Houston, where and it's held in the Brown Convention Center, where they have the political conventions. It's a huge, huge show. Anyway, I wanted to show it in Paducah, so I tried to get it in Paducah. With your application, you have to, it's a juried show, you have to include permission, written permission from the designer of the quilt. Well, I had designed the quilt, but each of the blocks was from a different professional designer, so I had to get a permission, written permission from each of those 30 teachers in order to be able to enter the quilt. It was quite a job. I tracked them down. They're from all over the country. Two of them were deceased, and so then I had to find who had permission to give permission to use their designs, and that was a bit of an adventure too. But anyway, the quilt was accepted, and it was shown in the 2016 quilt show in Paducah. And my daughters and I took a trip down to see the quilt in the show, and that was kind of a great ending. I shouldn't say ending for my quilting career, because I'm still quilting, but it was kind of a highlight. At one point, I said, I wrote something down about my quilting. And I said, my hobby turned into a stress reliever, a constant friend, a sense of fulfillment and accomplishment, and it turned into a way of life.
In the bulb there is a flower, in the seed an apple tree, in cocoons a hidden promise, butterflies will soon be free. In the cold and snow of winter, there's a spring that waits to be unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see. There's a song in every silence, seeking word and melody. There's a dawn in every darkness, bringing hope to you and me. From the past will come the future, what it holds a mystery, unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see.